Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of the second book of Chronicles, that is Divrei Hayam and Bet. We are about to study chapter 12, that is Perek Yud Bet, and we are still in the reign of the king Rehoboam. We have just learned of how in chapter 10, we read of the split of the kingdom, the rebellion of the northern tribes that left and rebelled against the kingship of Rehoboam and appointed their own king Yeroboam or Jeroboam. And then we read in the last chapter Rehoboam's response, which was to fortify his cities. It was clear that Rehoboam recognized that by bringing about this rift between the 12 tribes and breaking up the unity, which was the source of the power of Shlomo, of Solomon, and David before him, he exposed himself up to weakness in front of others. And that weakness is always going to be exploited. And what we are going to read about in chapter 12 is the exploitation of that weakness by the Pharoah Sheshak. It's not surprising at all to realize that the Pharoah Sheshak recognized that now that King Solomon's kingdom has broken up into pieces, even though Rehoboam was attempting to do his best to strengthen the towns, he was now at a very weak point. And as we know throughout history, the Egyptians on and off during this time period exerted their influence and power, and many times actually openly ruled over this area of the land of Canaan. It was now time for the Egyptians once again to raid into Judah and Israel. This raid that's about to occur, that we're going to read about in chapter 12, we of course did read about also in the book of Kings. And this is one of the interesting events in the Bible, which is corroborated as well by contemporaneous historical sources, and specifically at the Temple of Karnak in Egypt, the Pharoah Sheshak, which was the Egyptian name, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong, but so be it. Who's known here, we're going to read the Pharoah Sheshak in the Torah, or here in the words of the prophets. Led a raid into Israel and conquered many, many cities. From the context of what we're about to read, and from the context of the inscriptions at the Temple of Karnak, which can be seen today, if you know how to read those Egyptian hieroglyphics, that describes him conquering many towns and taking a lot of loot and booty. And the context seems that his intention was not to rule over it directly, but his intention was to despoil the area, come back with riches and wealth, and which is exactly what he did. And it was, and I'm going to translate this chaf here, which can be translated as, it was when the kingdom of Ravam was established. Hachin is from the lashon of Cain, chaf nun, to establish or to set right, right? But over here, I'm going to translate the chaf here as being, it was as he established his kingdom, ukichez again the same chaf, and as he established his strength, ozav Torah Adonai, to the same extent he abandoned the Torah, the law of God, the teaching of God, B'chol Yisrael Imo, and along with him, all of the people of Israel. Interestingly, it identifies all of the people of Israel, identifying that both the people in the northern kingdom and the people in the southern kingdom of Judah. But here we're focusing, of course, on Rehoboam, and the people he had most influence over in Judah were leaving God. In other words, when you focus on war and strength, rather than focusing on reuniting, focusing on rebuilding, focusing on bringing people back together, which should have been Rehoboam's emphasis, ultimately that would have resulted in a much stronger kingdom. Rehoboam instead focused his energy on trying to build the outer trappings of his father's Solomon's strength, and ignored the Torah of God, ignored loyalty to God by he, and therefore immediately, verse 2, Bashana HaChamishis, in the fifth year, Lemelech Rehoboam, the fifth year of the reign of the king Rehoboam, Allah Shishak Melech Mitzrayim al Yerushalayim, Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up and against Jerusalem and attacked Jerusalem, Ki Ma'alu Ba'adonai, because the people of Jerusalem had rebelled against God. What was this rebellion? It doesn't specify what it was. Obviously, it included disloyalty to God spiritually, but of course, in the after reading the chapters, the very split, the very disunity among the people, the very inability of the king and the leader to lead people towards God, to lead people towards unity. This is what opened the way for Shishak to come and attack. And what did he come with? Belapumasayim Rechav, with 1,200 chariots, with Vishishim Elef Parashim, and 60,000 horse riders, ve'ein mispar la'am, and not even uncountable numbers of foot soldiers, asher ba'u imo mitzrayim, that came with him from Egypt, lubim, sukiyim, v'chushim, people from Libya, people from Suki, or Soch, exactly where that is unclear, and Kushites, presumably Kushites come from somewhere in the Sudan / Ethiopia / Eritrea region of what's now those countries in Africa, south of Egypt. Vayilkod et areha mitzuros aser liyuda, and he captured, right? He completely conquered those fortified cities that were in Judah, those fortified cities we read about in the last chapter that Rehoboam set about to fortify. Vayavo ad Yerushalayim, and he came until the gates of Jerusalem. Interestingly, at the temple of Karnak, he lists the cities that he conquered, but he does not list Jerusalem as one of the cities that he conquered, which very much goes in line with what we are reading here so far and what we're about to read, that he did not actually conquer Jerusalem. Ushmaya Hanavi, and at this point, when the people were pressed, the people realized the consequences of their disunity. They realized the consequences of the mistakes that they had made, their focus on wealth, might, and power, instead of their focus on unity, togetherness, and worship of God, right? So Ushmaya Hanavi Ba'al Rechavam, this always happens. The prophet comes to tell the people, to teach the people the lesson they should be learning. So that Shemaiah, the same prophet we had in the last chapter, came to the king Rehoboam, V'sarei Yehuda, and all of the officers of Judah, Asher Nesvu al Yerushalayim, all of whom had now gathered. They were refugees running from the towns that they were leading. Now they're gathered in the capital, in the Pnei Shishak, to try to protect themselves from Shishak, the Pharaoh. Vayomer lem, and he said to them, Ko amar Adonai, so says God, Atem azavtem oti, you have abandoned me, v'afani azavti etchem biyad Shishak, and therefore I have abandoned you as well in the hands of Shishak. This is how the world works, and this is consistent throughout the book of Chronicles, as we shall see as we study it together. If you stay loyal to God, if you stick with the program, then you'll be successful. As soon as you stray from the program, as soon as you go into the desire for wealth, the desire for strength, the desire for might, all kinds of things like that, that's when you end up. That's when the enemy comes to overtake you. And the officers, the leaders of Israel, and the king himself humbled themselves. Vayomru, and they said, Sadik Adonai, God is righteous, we were wrong. They, at least temporarily, under duress at this time, recognized that they had made a mistake. When God saw that they had humbled themselves, obviously God knew that this is probably temporary, but at least at this point, they're learning the lesson, humility, which is the ultimate lesson that they need to learn, and humility before God. At this point, the word of God to Shemaiah was as follows: Nichneu lo ashchisem. Because they have humbled themselves, I will not destroy them. I'm going to give them a chance. They're going through terrible suffering. they're going to lose a lot, but I will not wipe them out. I'll still give them a chance. I'm going to give them a little bit of a pleta is a remnant or a deliverance. They had this big, strong kingdom. I'm not going to leave them a lot, but something I'll leave them so that they can hang on. And what am I going to leave? The city of Jerusalem. I will not allow my anger to pour against Jerusalem, Biad Shishak, in the hands of Shishak. Like I said, very interestingly, the contemporary record, Shishak brags about his victories over so many cities, but he does not brag about his victory over Jerusalem, which is very much in line with what the Torah, with what the Bible is teaching us here. Kiyu lo la'abadim, they will be subjected to him. They will have to be subservient to him. V'yedu'u avodasi, and thus they will know the difference between what it means when you serve me, va'avodas mamluchos ha'aratzos, and what happens when you have to serve and be subservient to the other nations. When you serve me, you get the greatness and grandeur of the kingdom we read about a few chapters ago, the grandeur of Solomon's kingdom, where the world comes to learn from you wisdom, the world comes to learn from you tzedek, umishpat, justice, and righteousness. And what happens when you're subservient to the kings around you, and all you have to do at that point is lose your wealth, lose your power, lose your independence, etc. They're going to learn what it means. And so what happened? Vayal, this is verse 9, Vayal Shishak Melech Mitzrayim al Yerushalayim, Shishak, the king of Egypt, then marched against Jerusalem, presumably laid siege to Jerusalem. Vayikach et utzros beis Adonai, and he took and he stole the treasures. Well, not in this case stealing, but it's conquered in war or whatever. He took the treasures of the storehouses of the house of God, and the treasures stored in the king's house in the palace. He took everything of value. Just a generation ago, we read about how Shlomo had all this gold, and he made these shields out of gold, shields that were more ceremonial than anything else, that were held by the guards of the temple. He stole them, took them, and that was it. And Rehoboam made instead of them maginei nechoshet, bronze shields. And he gave them into the entrusted them in the hands of those who the officers who were in charge of watching the door of the entranceway to the house of the king. So Rehoboam, somewhat to his credit here, he does not completely despair. He says, okay, I have no gold. I'm going to use bronze, and I'll do the best I can with what I'm left with. And it was that whenever the king would come to the temple, ba'u haratzim, literally the ratzim here are the runners. So they're the messengers that they would take these shields in and out of their storage places, their protected storage places, unisa'om, and they would carry them, v'heshivum el toharatzim, and they would bring them back afterwards. So when the king came, bronze, which, when it's burnished and shined, is almost as nice as gold, not quite, but at least it's nice. And when the king came, they would bring it out in his honor. And so that what happened was that when he humbled himself, shav mimenu af Adonai, the anger of God was taken, the anger of God was suppressed, below hashchit likala, and he did not destroy to the extent of complete destruction. He allowed a remnant to remain. The gam b'Yehuda hayad dvarim tovim. And also within Yehuda, there were good things found. Now, does this mean that there was some treasure left, good things in terms of material good things? Or does this mean that there were still some good things left in the people? They weren't totally bad, which is why God did not completely destroy them. And I think both of the connotations are meant here. There were good things. There were still some bronze shields. There was still some stuff left. But also, there was something good to be said. They understood the lesson and they humbled themselves. We'll see how long that lasts. But at least for the time being, they understood that they had been wrong. So what happens afterwards? we have the same language. Whenever a language, a word is used over and over again, it's a sign that the chronicler, the writer, the prophet writing this is trying to tell us, zero in on this word. Vayitchazek here in verse 13 is the same as the word in the beginning, ukechezkato, in the first verse, right? We said that when Rehoboam built up his strength and his power, right, his might, Azav, he abandoned God. So this word should scare you. We just talked about how he humbled himself, but now it says again the same word, Vayitchazek, the king Rehoboam b'Yerushalayim, Hamelech b'Yerushalayim vayimloch, strengthened himself again, right, and ruled. Kiven arboim v'achashana Rehoboam b'malcho. He was 41 years old when he became king. Ushva esrei shana malach b'Yerushalayim, and he was king for 17 years in Jerusalem. Ha'ir asher b'chara Adonai, the city, Jerusalem, the city which God had chosen, lasum et shmosham, to place his name there, mikol shebtei Yisrael, from within all of the tribes of Israel, v'shem imo Naamah ha'amonit, and his mother's name was Naamah ha'amonit. And as we said, vayitchazek, again, after this, the lesson didn't last too long. He strengthened himself, vayas hora, he did evil, he did bad. He did not properly set his heart, lidroshes Adonai, to search out, to seek out God. His humility was not long lasting. It was fleeting, and he did not use it to permanently improve himself. If you want to know more about the history of Rehoboam, verse 15, v'divrei Rehoboam harishonim v'achronim, if you really want to know more about the events of Rehoboam's reign in the early days and in the late days, Elohim Ketuvim, they are written b'divrei Shemaiah Hanavi, in the words of Shemaiah the prophet, v'ido hachozeh, and Ido the seer, the other prophet of the time. We read more stories about Ido back in the Book of Kings as well together. These were books that were also used to lay out the genealogies and the lineages. Umilchamot Rehoboam, and the books that described the wars that Rehoboam was involved in, V'Yeravam, and also of Yeravam, Jeroboam, Kol Hayamim, all of their days on the king. So apparently there was some sort of chronicle, some sort of annal, which all these records were kept. Unfortunately, to this day, lost to history, but they're there somewhere, or they were there at some point. It would be amazing if someone would ever find these, but as of now, the only other source besides the Bible we have is what we can find archaeologically. And we have the records, the annals of Sheshak, at least some of them, in the temple of Karnak, but the records of Rehoboam and Yeravam, we do not have. After 17 years of reign, so which means that he was 58 years old, he laid with his fathers, which is a euphemism for he passed on. And he was buried in the city of David. And his son Aviyah became king in his stead. Aviyah, we read about him in last chapter, was the favorite son that was designated by Rehoboam in his lifetime to be his successor. So Aviyah became his successor. It does seem that Rehoboam learned a significant lesson from Shlomo, his father. If you remember, when David's life and reign were ending, there were lots of contenders to the throne among David's children, and it took some amount of violence to occur before Shlomo secured his reign. Rehoboam made sure in his lifetime to set up his successor, which is Aviyah, who we will read about a bit in upcoming chapters. So here we have the story of the reign of Rehoboam, a tragic one, a difficult one, a challenging one which almost brought about the complete destruction of Jerusalem, but because of a little bit of humility, the complete destruction didn't happen. God gave them a chance, but it doesn't seem like they really did take the chance, although there was still Dvarim Tovim, there were still good things hanging out in Judah. Thank you so much for studying chapter 12 together. Looking forward to studying chapter 13 and the rest of this book of Chronicles. Have a wonderful day.